Okay, this talk is going to be on human pedigrees. First off, I'd like to talk a little bit about medical genetics, which is really where all this is heading. The idea is that we're interested in studying the traits of inherited disorders. That is, these are traits that aren't really good for humans, and they're inherited over the generations. We might call them a genetic disease. The first approach to studying them is, of course, the only approach that was really available earlier on in the 20th century, which was using pedigree analysis based on classical genetics. We'll talk about what that is in just a bit. And then beyond that, we can study those with modern molecular techniques, and we'll learn more about those as the course progresses. The first thing is let's ask ourselves a question. Why can't we study humans like Mendel studied peas? I mean, if you want to study the inheritance of traits across humans' generations, and these are bad traits, like I said, so they're genetic diseases, it would kind of be convenient, right, if we could study them the way that Mendel studied peas. But there are a few differences between humans and peas. First of all, the generation time of humans is pretty long. I mean, at least 15, 20 years before you can have a kid. And peas, you can have a couple of generations in a single year. So it would take a long time to study humans the way that Mendel studied peas. Also, Mendel, controlled the breeding of peas. And while I guess you could, cage up some humans and force them to breed, it's not very ethical. Anyway, so given that you can't study them with the techniques that Mendel developed, or as we're going to learn, the techniques that Morgan developed to look at fruit flies, what can you do? Well, you can sort of look at the family trees, look at the inheritance of traits that's already out there, that people have, that you can follow from the breeding that humans have already done on their own volition. And so you use pedigree analysis to analyze the inheritance of traits over, the existing human generations. You start with a propositus, a person who first comes to the doctor and says, I got a problem, and you work your way back, through their brothers and sisters, through their parents, through their grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, etc. And you determine the type of inheritance by inference, whether, the disease is dominant or recessive, whether individuals within those generations are dominant or have dominant or recessive traits, whether they're carrying the dominant or recessive alleles, what's their genotype, and the overall inheritance of the disease. So here are some symbols that are used in pedigree analysis, and let me zoom in on some of these so you can see them. So you've got males are squares, females are circles. You connect them with a line if they're mating. Here you have a little nuclear family with children, and the order of the birth is from left to right. We won't use these much, but here's how you do fraternal twins, identical twins, etc. Let's move on up to the top of the other column here. Okay, affected individuals are always shown as in colored. Is sort of darkened in circles. This you won't see very much, but you might see heterozygotes listed with sort of this half and half symbol. If you're a carrier of a sex-linked recessive disease, then you'll have a little dot. Death is with a line through it. That's not used very often. The propositus is, like I said, the person who first contacted the doctor. You typically have an arrow point to them, and you can specify an individual in the entire family tree just with a simple sort of code like this. The generations are numbered with Roman numerals, and the individuals within a generation are numbered in Arabic numerals. So you take to identify the individual who's being pointed at here, it would be Roman numeral 2, number 2. And this is interesting. If you have a consanguineous marriage, you'll specify that with 2 lines connecting the individuals. Now you might be asking yourself, what the heck is a consanguineous marriage? Sanguine means happy, so a consanguineous marriage is a marriage that isn't happy, aka an example of inbreeding, incest, marriage between cousins, parents, and children, etc. Now you may be saying, ooh, how does that take place in humans? Well, it does take place from time to time, certainly cousin marriages. Um, and I guess if you're developing a pedigree of dogs, cats, any other type of animal that's bred, those take, breeding individuals that are that closely related is pretty common in order to, fix recessive alleles. Anyway, we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, this sort of inbreeding did take place historically. Here we can take a look at the Egyptian royal family. It's pretty amazing, actually. It's kind of confusing because a lot of the males are named Ptolemy and a lot of the females are named Arsenal and Cleopatra. But they had this idea that you need to keep the royal blood pure, don't have a lot of breeding with, outsiders. And what happened was just a massive amount of inbreeding. Here we see in this generation a cross between brother and sister. This is where it starts getting kind of crazy. Let me zoom out just a little bit. And the offspring of those folks married Cleopatra the first, so this is not so surprising, but they had 3 kids, of which one daughter basically had kids with both her brothers, and one brother not only had kids with his sister, but the daughter of his sister through his brother, and generated the rest of the family here. And then here you see that this woman has kids with 2 brothers, and of course this brother has a kid with a sister, and this brother here has a kid with, I guess, his niece, and the kid and his son also has a kid with his cousin. Anyway, and you'll see that this royal family ends up with the famous Cleopatra of history, who not only had kids with her 2 brothers, but also with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, who were 2/3 of the triumvirate of Rome. Anyway, the Egyptian royal family, it's fascinating. Well, as you might be saying to yourself, ooh, well, and the reason I think we say ooh, and there's a taboo against this in many cultures around the world, is that there is a problem with genetic diseases that crop up when you have intense inbreeding, and some of you might be able to imagine why. Well, let's talk about it in the next series of slides. Here you see an image of a pedigree chart of an the European royal families. And there's this disease, porphyria, which is actually related to vampirism. It's a blood disease, results in reduced iron and susceptibility to UV radiation, where you see a few consanguineous marriages. You see it is pretty common in these royal families. Even between Albert and Victoria here, who then we'll see in the next slide go on to become the ancestors. Well, go on to have some descendants who include the current royal family in Britain, Elizabeth II and Charles, and even Elizabeth II, when she married Prince Philip, that was a second cousin, I think second cousin, third cousin, second cousin of hers. So anyway, now what's moving through that particular royal family, not necessarily because of close consanguineous marriages, is hemophilia. We'll talk about that disease in just a bit. Okay, so the whole purpose of developing pedigree charts and trying to see how diseases run through family is trying to predict the inheritance pattern of that disease, trying to predict the type of disease it is. Is it recessive or dominant? Is it autosomal or is it sex-linked? Well, we'll talk in just a bit about what autosomal and sex-linked are. But basically, genotypes can be inferred sometimes. So one of the things you'll notice with the recessive disease is that it can skip a generation. Here you have 2 parents, each who do not have the disease have kids who do. And so you figure that the parents are heterozygotes if the disease is, the trait is recessive. They're carrying one of the alleles, but they have a good allele. They have a dominant allele for this particular condition, so they're not exhibiting the disease, but their kids are. So these two in the middle were unfortunate enough to get two copies of the allele. But what's interesting is that you can't necessarily know the genotype of the other two kids. They could be heterozygotes and not exhibiting disease, or they could have each gotten a dominant allele from their parents. So genotypes can be inferred, but not always. Types of inherited traits and disorders: autosomal recessive, autosomal dominant, X-linked recessive, and X-linked dominant. Just as to define this really quickly, the autosomes are the chromosomes that are not the sex chromosomes. So they're basically identical. That is, the pairs are homologous. Each individual chromosome that you get from your mom is very similar to the chromosome you get from your dad. There's just different versions of alleles on the different genes, but overall it's basically the same chromosome, whereas the sex chromosomes are vastly different. If you have an X and a Y, like you're a male, those can be very different, as we'll see as we study the chromosomes a little bit later in the course. So here's an autosomal recessive pedigree. You can see the affected individuals are they're dark colored here, and there's not a whole lot of them, and it appears to skip a generation, wherein you have unaffected parents have an affected child. So the rules are: the disorder appears in the progeny of unaffected parents. Affected progeny include both males and females. It's not sex-linked. We'll look into that in just a bit. There are few affected individuals, few black symbols, and most who carry the allele are heterozygotes. Here is another look at an autosomal recessive disorder. And you can see that it skips generations, but it appears here in the fourth generation. Interestingly, it appears in the fourth generation after a consanguineous marriage, after a marriage among some cousins. There are a lot of people that are potentially carriers in this family. However, when two carriers get together, bada bing, bada boom, you could have some individuals that get the disorder. That's why looking for dates at the family reunions, not a good idea. Now this is an autosomal dominant pedigree. It's important to note here the disease allele, the allele for having the disease, is actually dominant. If you have one copy, you got the disease. So what are the characteristics of these diseases? The phenotype tends to appear in every generation. That's important. Affected mothers and fathers pass on the phenotype to both sons and daughters. So it's not sex-linked, it's on autosomes. Most people are heterozygotes, and most matings are heterozygotes times homozygous individuals. Homozygous individuals are common in the population. Homozygous recessive individuals are common in the population, and so the individual habit tend to mate with them, and they pass on to their kids in 1-to-1 ratios. Autosomal dominant disease, so you can see it appears in every generation, and both men and women are affected. Now, X-linked disorders. These differ from autosomal disorders. The idea here is that males only have one copy of the X chromosome. They have a Y chromosome. Females have two. So basically, males are never carriers. If they have a mutated gene on the X chromosome, it will be expressed. They're hemizygous. This is a new word for us here. This is sort of halfway in between heterozygous and homozygous. It corresponds for males who have XY genotype, and they have one copy of the X chromosome. They express whatever trait is on that X chromosome. They don't have a good copy to sort of counteract it, as like a heterozygous female might have. And so as a result, this disorder is never passed from father to son. Fathers only pass their Y chromosomes to their sons. They don't pass their X chromosomes. So that means, it's never passed from father to son. Here is an X-linked recessive disorder. Skips a generation, as you can see here, and it's never passed from father to son. And it looks like male individuals get this from their grandfather through their mother. Alright, cut some text on this. The females must have two copies of the allele to express the disorder, so you very seldomly see that they have it. Now, many of these are well known: color blindness, hemophilia, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and hey, even male pattern baldness, like your teacher, Mr. Davis, has. It's never passed from father to son, as I said before, and males are much more likely to be affected. They only have one copy or I'm sorry, they only need one copy of the mutant allele to express the phenotype. Affected males get the disorder from their mothers, and all the daughters are obligate carriers. So that's something to keep in mind. Like if any of the female students out in the class have a colorblind father, then you're an obligate carrier of the disorder, and 50% of your sons will have the mutant allele. But you know, colorblindness is not that big of a deal, but other X-linked disorders are. Now, these disorders are typically passed from an affected grandfather to 50% of his grandsons. That's just saying the same thing as said before. Here's another view of an X-linked recessive, and this one that I scanned in from a textbook is a little bit different. It's got the genotypes here, but they sort of look like the notation that we're familiar with. They're a little bit different. You can see for females you have XX, but you put the the allele up above here in the superscript, so they're X big A, and males have XY, and then you only put the allele that is living on that on that X chromosome on one of those two. So here you see it skips a generation, and here you'll note that the females are carriers if they have a little dot in the circle in the center. So that'll become important. So here you see what happened is that an X chromosome with the disorder was passed on to a daughter, and she married a guy who wasn't carrying the disorder at all, but one of her sons, gets the disorder, the allele for the disorder from her, and since he doesn't have an X chromosome, another X chromosome to counteract it, he has the disorder. Now let's talk about X-linked dominant disorders. These are interesting. Let's get a close look at these. Appears in every generation, so there's no generations that skipped. That suggests a dominant disorder. Now how's it affecting males and females? Well, both males and females are affected, but here in this generation only females are affected. That's interesting. I wonder if something's going on there. Let's take a look at some of the descriptions of these disorders. It's expressed in females when one copy of the mutated gene is present. So it's not like a recessive disorder. You only have to have one copy, and it lives on the X chromosome. Females have two, but if one is bad, then they have the disorder. Very few of these have been identified, but there have been some. Now, it's never passed from father to son. Think about that for a minute. Why would never pass from father to son? Well, here again, just like in the recessive case, fathers give their sons their Y chromosome. So you can't pass an X-linked disorder, a disorder that's on the X chromosome, through the Y chromosome. So affected males produce only affected females, because that's who their daughters or who they're giving their X chromosome to. Affected females, typically heterozygous, produce 50% normal and 50% affected offspring, because to them, an X chromosome is kind of like an autosome between mothers and daughters. Now, males are usually much more severely affected than females, as they do not have a normal copy of the gene to balance the effects of the mutation on their single X chromosome. So it sounds like, in general with these X-linked disorders, males have it worse, but in this case, females have it worse, because females are much more likely to be affected in the population, because they have two X chromosomes. They have two chances to inherit the mutant allele. So here we'll take a look at the disorder that's X-linked dominant with a female parent. As you can see, she passes this on to both her sons and her daughters through her X chromosomes, and about half of her kids get it, because half of her alleles are the mutant allele, or the disorder. All right, well, let's look at the other case. Here's an X-linked dominant with a male parent, and here you can see that basically he only passes it to his daughters, but he passes it to all of his daughters because he's giving each of his daughters his only X chromosome, which happens to be the one with a mutation on it with a disorder. All right, let's go back and take a second look at that X-linked dominant pedigree. Now that we know some of the characteristics of this, you see a male that's affected only passes it on to his daughters. They're in the second generation. Now these daughters pass it on to both their sons and their daughters, and then each of the sons in the second generation only pass it on to their daughters, or in the third generation only pass it on to their daughters in the fourth generation. Okay, so now let's do a little bit of a problem. I do this in class, but you can try to answer it on your own. A rare human disease afflicted a family, shown in the accompanying pedigree. Alright, deduce the most likely mode of inheritance. So now would be the time to press the pause button to see if you can figure this out. Is it autosomal or X-linked? Is it recessive or is it dominant? Hit the pause button now. Okay, we're back. So hopefully you figured this out. It's actually dominant and X-linked. X-linked dominant. Well, why is that? Well, it appears in every generation. But you might be saying to yourself, hey, that first generation up there doesn't have the disorder. But actually, look what happens is that disorder comes into the family in the second generation, and then every generation subsequent to that has individuals with the disorder. So, and you'll notice that here that this father here, this male, gives it to all of his daughters. So that suggests that it's X-linked. And here's another male that gives it to all of his daughters. And even if we scooch on over here, oops, let me zoom out just a little bit. Oh, wrong way. Go out just a little bit. There's another individual where a male gives it to his one daughter. And you see a female here gives it to a son. So anyway, that it is an X-linked dominance. Okay, and with that, I'm done with this talk. We'll take a look at some problems in just a bit further in the course where you'll have to determine the inheritance pattern, the type of disorder it is, just based on pedigrees. It's incredibly useful because once you know that, then you can kind of predict what happens when you marry certain people, or how many of your kids could have the disorder. And developing pedigrees is really crucial to figuring out, a lot of stuff about genetic diseases, what chromosome it's on, and ultimately, what the gene is for a particular disease. So, very important stuff. All right, that's the end of this talk.